Climate-driven extinction. Well, that puts me back to the fifth assessment of the IPCC published in 2014. They had a very, very important section. It was a big section on extinction and the effect of climate change. What they said was that climate change would increase the rate of extinction under every single scenario.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. We're happy that you're here with us today. I'm your host. I'm Herb Simmens. I'm the author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future and a co-founder of the Healthy Planet Action Coalition. And our two regular climate experts, Paul Beckwith from Ottawa, who is a climate systems scientist and who has published probably more YouTube videos on every aspect of climate than anyone on the planet, and Dr. Peter Carter, who is a retired medical doctor, the founder of the Climate Emergency Institute, a reviewer for the IPCC, and someone passionately engaged in looking at the relationship between climate and health. And our topic today is climate-driven extinction, an important topic and one that we're looking forward to addressing with our experts. We want to encourage you to like our videos, to subscribe to our videos, and also to comment on our videos. As we read all of your comments, we benefit from hearing your views and your suggestions for making our channel even better. So with that, I want to introduce today first Dr. Peter Carter. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Herb. So first of all, I should just say that I am definitely still in a state of shock after reading over all the dictatorial executive orders of the new Trump administration. But there we go, I'll do my best. But however, I should point out that we're losing environmental protection regulations and provisions that have been building up over the past 50 years. So that's going to be devastating to the climate and devastating to species, because the long-held protection by the United States is gone, basically. Climate-driven extinction. Well, that puts me back to the fifth assessment of the IPCC published in 2014. They had a very, very important section. It was a big section on extinction and the effect of climate change. What they said was that climate change would increase the rate of extinction under every single scenario. So even under the best case scenario of 2014, which we cannot do now because it was a decline in emissions by 2020, climate change would increase, and it would have eventually a multiplier effect, of course, would increase the rate of extinction. That rate of extinction, the big paper was in 2017 by Cabellos and Ehrlich, and called the biological annihilation of the ongoing sixth extinction of vertebrate species. 2 years ago, they extended that to other species outside of vertebrate species, and that's a very, very important paper. As you may have heard, the extinction rate is up to 1,000 times, maybe, the background rate, certainly many, many hundreds of times the background rate. The fifth assessment relied on a huge paper published by Thomas and colleagues, in which they estimated that by 2050, the climate change effects on species extinction would be higher than the effects that we have now, which is primarily, of course, habitat loss, degradation, and transformation. So a lot of people notice that. I actually was published in a book on the Sustainable Development Goals a few years ago, in which I addressed the relationship between species extinction and climate change. And that's pretty terrible because there's a negative interaction, almost a negative synergy. So the more extinct species get driven to extinction, which of course is a marker for ecosystem degradation and damage, the more the climate change gets increased, the more emissions go up because the less efficient is the carbon sink, the land carbon sink. And we've got that happening already. The land carbon sink over the past few years has been reduced in efficiency. So that's a pretty bad situation, I must say. And it works the other way, of course. Obviously, global climate change, global climate disruption will, as I say, increase the rate of species extinctions. I don't think I can say anything beyond that.
Thank you, Peter. I think you bring up such a critical, important point. The idea, of course, that we know, but often difficult to conceptualize, and that is this systemic relationship between every aspect of the Earth and climate and how they interact. And if we just look narrowly at extinction without recognizing the knock-on second, third, fourth impacts on greenhouse gases, on ecosystem health, and so forth, and vice versa, we're only getting a limited picture. And so thank you for beginning to paint, sort of a broader picture of what this is all about. When I was writing my book and I came across the term extinction obituary as a means of basically acknowledging this profound loss. Of course, there is the whole psychological dimension. And I just want to give a quote that I included in the book from a conservation ranger about the extinction of an animal called the forest skink, a lizard that went extinct in 2014. And he said, "You're looking at the last individual, knowing that when this individual will die, as it inevitably would, that it would be the end of that long evolutionary history." And then he said, and this is the phrase that sticks with me, "It's a scar on our conscience." So with that, I want to turn it over to Paul for your thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Herb, and thank you, Peter. Let's discuss a very recent paper in Science. It was published at the beginning of December 2024, and the title is Climate Change Extinctions, of all things. The author is Mark Urban, and it's basically a meta-analysis, meaning it looks at 485 different studies, peer-reviewed papers mostly, I'm sure the vast majority of them. Within those papers, there's over 5 million projections on what people think about extinction and loss of biodiversity. And interestingly enough, this paper, just over a month, it's had 14,263 downloads. So people are downloading it, people are having a look at it. It basically argues that, the rising temperatures, the negative effects to biodiversity means that the projection is about 1/3 of Earth species will be extinct by 2050. And the next third will be extinct by towards the end of the century, according to the sort of overview of, what people think. And there's a lot of different papers, a lot of things published. The UN has the COP conferences, as you know. Many of us here in this group attended Baku, COP29 in Baku. There's also a conference on biodiversity, which I managed to attend with Charles and Heidi in a few years ago. And that was in Montreal. And they have targets of 30 by 30. You might have heard that expression. They want to protect 30% of lands by 2030 for species to be able to survive on. But because of the accelerated rate of climate change, okay, we've talked about how the rates have accelerated in the last few years even, and the reasons for it. Herb mentioned the species extinction rate is 1,000 times higher than the natural extinction rate. And I've seen some reports where it actually puts a range. It says 1,000 to 10,000 times higher. So, that number has increased quite a bit. I mean, is it any surprise? 40% of all land surfaces on the planet have been converted to food production. Agriculture alone is responsible for about 90% of global deforestation. and it uses up about 70% of fresh water. So these are very sobering statistics. And the problem is the rate of change of climate, as I mentioned, is just way too high for many species to adapt. So you need to look at individual species and individual ecosystems. Some of them are much worse off than others. So I've often talked about polar temperature amplification, the Arctic's warming depending on your latitude, depending on how you define the Arctic, it's at least 4 times faster than the global average. If you go to higher latitudes, it's more like 5 to 7 times faster. So species living up in the Arctic have a real struggle to try to adapt to these huge rising temperatures. Also, Antarctica is warming at least double the rate of the global average, maybe even 3 times. And there's not many species down there, but the ones that are down there are being greatly affected both on land and in the oceans. If you're on an island and the sort of climate niche, the precipitation patterns, the temperatures, which are responsible for the types of vegetation and how well vegetation does on that island, if those conditions change, then you can't really, if you're a land species, then you can't move elsewhere. If you have the means as a species, then there's tremendous migration at fast rates to higher latitudes in both the north and southern hemispheres, and to higher elevations if you're on a mountain. But of course, that's limited because if the conditions are changing too much on the mountain, you can only go up so high before conditions aren't suitable. So those sort of niches are affected disproportionately. And we're not just losing the main species, we're losing bacterial species, fungus, insects is a big one. And these are all intricately connected in the web of life, if you like. So there's a lot of unexpected things happening when we lose this number of species. We're threatening our very web of life on this planet.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, in my book, I call it the basically the great biotic migration. As you eloquently point out, Paul, I mean, everything is moving, whether it's humans, it's fungi, it's bacteria. Of course, plants can't move very easily themselves, but they can, their pollen can be, create new life further north or further south, depending upon which hemisphere they're in. I read somewhere where the average creature in the sea is moving 10 kilometers a year or a decade, probably changing all the time further north or further south. I mean, sometimes I forget this, that essentially the one characteristic of all of life is that we damn well want to continue living. And that's what we're seeing is this really, depending upon how closely we as human beings identify with other life. And of course, many of our fellow human beings don't for whatever reason, or not very much. But to the degree to which we identify closely, it's so tragic to think about the fact that you've got these literally billions and hundreds of billions of creatures of all sorts that, as a result of our influence, are basically frantically trying to find some new niche that will allow them to survive a bit longer or a lot longer. So with that, I want to turn it back to you, Peter.
Oh, thanks, Herb. And thanks for making that most important of all points, our relationship, with the whole of nature within which we live and on which we completely depend on. That is absolutely fundamental to what we're doing with regard to species and ecosystems. I also want to mention, of course, that plants, including trees, we have a loss of biodiversity there. We're aware of the forests now because of the Amazon, of course, which is crashing. And we lose plants. That is another multiplier effect on the number of vertebrate and other species that we lose. And science really hasn't gone into that very deeply, although there have been papers published which points out the extreme importance. The paper that I just mentioned a couple of years ago, does it matter? What is the effect? Well, they address this. And their paper is on what they call the mutilation of the tree of life. So, as I say, we're not just losing species now, we're losing genera which is whole families of species, and the interaction and the support of each other we're losing, especially, of course, when we put in plants. So the paper comes to the conclusion that the mutilation of the tree of life and the resulting loss, accompanying loss of ecosystem services provided by biodiversity to humanity is a serious threat to the stability of our situation with agriculture, food, water quality, everything involved. And they call for immediate political, economic, and social efforts of an unprecedented scale, which are essential if we are to prevent catastrophic. We've already had catastrophic extinctions, of course, but if we are to prevent a catastrophic effect on us and on civilization, the paper that Paul mentioned, the author Urban, actually a few years ago published a really, really important paper in which he projected that, in fact, climate change, even committed climate change that we're already committed to, would have a catastrophic effect on the whole of the biosphere. And I presented at several conferences in which I put all the indicators together, and we're on a rapid, rapid trend for a collapse of the biosphere itself. So that's where we're headed. But the solution really is the one that Herb mentioned. It's a psychological, emotional, and that's the solution.
Thank you, Peter. It also strikes me, in addition to or as part of the psychological connection that is essential maybe as a prerequisite to preservation, our economic system, without going into a whole other subject. Some of you may see a program we did on climate-driven inflation that dealt with the economic system. But, I was reading recently a paper that made I thought, very a compelling claim that, you might say that, well, this is all very nice. If we try to preserve species and not cut down forests and not eat fish and not do this and not do the other, that our economy will collapse, corporations won't be able to make any money, et cetera. And what this paper attempted to do was to measure, at least roughly, the value of the natural capital that is being essentially depleted by our corporations and indeed our whole society, all of us to some degree or other. And if they built that in, they would find that there's almost no corporation in history that has ever made $1 or £1 or anything, if you factor in the fact that they're living off of natural capital, which is essentially zero, whether it's polluting into the air, pulling species out of the ground and so forth. So it's largely an artifact of this economic system that we have created, for better or worse, along with the psychological detachment that has, I think, in part or in large part, put us into this horrible, horrible dilemma we're in. With that, I'll turn it back to Paul.
Yes, good points, everybody. So, fresh on my mind is an article that I read online in the Atlantic, and it's called The Antisocial Century. It talks about the solitude that people faced and the hunkering down in their homes because of COVID and how that has continued. And the reason I think that's important is because we're kind of stepping away from nature. Lots of people don't experience nature. They'd rather be, and if they are out in nature, they're not walking, smelling, listening in the woods. They're on their phones. Their phones are shoved up to their faces and they're not really taking in the nature around them. And this is, I think, going to become a bigger and bigger problem. When people have less social contact with each other, they can develop distorted thoughts based on fake social media, et cetera. And, then once they get these views ingrained, then, it's very hard to break them. So just one statistic, people that dine in restaurants alone has gone up 29% in the past 2 years. Just in the last 2 years, 74% of restaurant business is takeout and delivery. Before COVID, it was about 60%. It was already taking off. People just are addicted to their technology, to their smartphones. And we know that the information is degrading from social media sites because of the concentration of ownership. And I think AI can go either way. It can help people find the truth if they do the searches, but I've seen studies that show that AI can be fooled very easily with just a few studies that are erroneous. So if people have a malicious intent, they can manipulate AI such that it's not actually giving you the correct sort of the truth, if you like. So all of these things are saying that we're getting a large degradation in the human ecosystem, right? The way we relate to other people, the way we meet people, the way young people are brought up, the way our brains are wired. And so if we can't deal with our own human ecosystem, how can we possibly deal or be concerned or worried about the natural ecosystem until it collapses and the services are not provided? More diseases will probably proliferate, and we have huge risks to our global food supply system. So yeah, it's pretty dire. I mean, the topics of this video are quite dire. You know, when we talk about the previous extinctions, they were happening on geological time. So the time scales were massive. We're just like a blink on the surface of the planet in terms of the overall scheme of things. And in that blink of time, in that little spike that we get to exist on this planet, we're messing things up royally. And all the signs are showing that unless we take this seriously, our time is going to be very limited. So anyway, yeah, it's pretty dire stuff, but it is what it is.
And thank you, Paul. And of course, that's what we're committed to here is telling the truth as we know it. Others may have different truth, but we're not here to sugarcoat or exaggerate, deny, but to the best of our knowledge and ability to try to convey the what we see and what we interpret from and convey from what others, leading scientists around the world, are telling us about what is happening on the planet. And it's interesting when you talked about the dining alone, I thought of the famous book written a few years ago by the sociologist Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, which essentially was the same thesis. So you bowled alone and then you dined alone
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
going and joining a bowling league or going out to eat with your friends or so. And I guess you could, find almost any social place, third place, and see people right sitting there with their plugs in and this and that and the other. And speaking about how quickly that occurred, the iPhone basically came out in what 2000 and late 2007, 2008. There
Right.
was no faster technological innovation. Within a few years, virtually everybody on the planet had one, and no one can predict or explain the incredible behavioral consequences and even the rewiring of our brains. So, in addition to everything else we've talked about being a challenge, we also have to deal with the fact, and I'm certainly, it's like I'm ready to go to a 12-step program for iPhones. I'm certainly more addicted to it than I would like to be. Hopefully, I'm doing it in a constructive manner for my own health and the health of the planet, but, who knows? Maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, one last point I want to mention. The average American adult goes to 3 movies a year at theaters, and they watch about 8 movies a week online in their homes. So 8 movies a week times 52 weeks, that's over 400 movies they'll watch, and only 3 of those will be in a movie theater, right? Just to give you an idea, I mean, it changes our entire society, how cities operate. Everything changes, and it's all basically from the advent of the iPhone, about that time frame that you're talking about, 2007, 2008.
Right. And for those of you who are listening or watching and wondering why we've shifted to this topic, it's because everything's connected. That's why. Because all this is relevant to extinction. And the broader you cast the extinction net, the more you can begin to appreciate all of the factors that directly or indirectly go into it. And before I wrap up, I just wanted to ask Peter, do you have any last quick comments you'd like to make?
Yeah, there's one. I completely agree that the technological explosive technological effect on us is it's not going to be very good with respect to how we treat Mother Earth and how we look at other species. And so my final point would be the vast majority of human populations that have existed on this planet have believed and known that this planet is the mother of all the tree of life, and that is sacred. And in fact, all our organized big religions, they've documented that Earth is sacred. But of course, there's no awareness or feeling out there really within our culture whatsoever. The indigenous people, yes, but our culture, no. And I think that what Paul brought up is really, really important because that's just going to drive us further away from our affection of planet Earth.
Thank you, Peter. And that strikes me that I'm thinking of the term, I guess it's still used, maybe not as much as many years ago, of tree hugger, that was often used as a term of derision. Oh, she's just a tree hugger. And yet, what could be more life affirming than hugging a tree? And in fact, there's actually, I saw some articles recently that hugging a tree, you actually get the energy from the tree coming up from the earth. And it's not new age babble. It's actually more and more science that being physically connected through plants, through animals, to the earth, to the soil is how we evolved. And yet it's scorned, it's minimized, it's laughed at. And on that note, I want to thank our panelists for really, I think, an extraordinary discussion today. And I want to again remind everybody, if you like this, then like it. Subscribe to our channel and leave us your comments on what we've said and what you'd like us to do. And as always, we'll be back next week with another program from the Climate Emergency Forum. Thank you very much.